Realtors of Reddit, what's the most disturbing history you've learned about a house you were selling? The lady next door to me died and wasn't found until she was more liquid than solid on her living room carpet. The family couldn't pay something about back taxes or something, and the house went to HUD to auction. HUD paid for some cleanup, but not to replace the carpet, only steam clean it. So it finally sold, and was talking to the guy who was flipping it before I could mention the death. He asked if the house had a water leak under the foundation, because when they ripped up the carpet and pad to put down the lament floor, it was really dirty and got all over them and their clothes. Told him what happened and how HUD went cheap on what to fix before the auction. He got green as a pea and started puking right there on his side of the fence. My grandma sells rents houses in the Denver area. A few weeks ago I had to help her evict a few college bros from one of her properties. This is a cottage style home, no second floor, no basement. These guys literally dug a hole in the wood floor and made a basement where they've been throwing trash away for the last year. Like it's a living room, with a TV, and a couple armchairs, and a giant hole in the ground filled with ice cream wrappers, pizza boxes, and cigarette butts. That seems like 1000x more effort than just taking the fricking garbage out. My parents were realtors, and also flipped houses. When I was growing up I used to help them a lot, usually by cleaning. When I was 12 I was helping with a house that was infested with roaches. I noticed the closets were smeared with crap and children's handprints. There were fingernail scratches on the insides of the doors as well. I asked my parents why this was the case. They told me the old tenants used to lock their toddlers in the closets for days. How about the one I bought? A kid drowned in the pool. So far every person that I have met asks me, you know what happened there, right? People are nosy. My mother passed away in my childhood home, which my dad eventually sold. Years later, my brother was picking up the youth group kids and one teen got in and said our house is haunted. Years ago, a lady died in there. My brother looked her dead in the eye and said she was my mom actually. Poor kid burst into tears immediately. My brother has such a horribly dry sense of humor. Got a good deal on an old apartment cause a lady was beaten to death next door. It was an old house converted into separate units. Guess the one thing you can't beat is a good deal. Not that I was buying but one I was visiting. I went to visit my sister in California and once I flew in I wanted to shower. Well, I took a long enough shower that the mirror was all steamy when I got out, except one tiny dot in the middle of the mirror. My immediate thought process was, oh weird. I guess if you draw on a mirror with Expo it won't steam around it. So I went to go investigate and upon looking right up to it I realized it was a freaking camera lens. Well, I freaked and ran out to her room and dressed, then went and told her. We went around our back and looked in a utility closet type thing that looked like it was in line with her room. Sure enough, the drywall had been cut away and repatched at some point. We cut it open and while there was no camera there was a little lens still stuck to the mirror. It's real freaky to think whoever was getting actually spied on and if they ever actually knew. Not a realtor, but I used to rent an apartment that was in a converted Victorian asylum. It was rumored to be haunted but I never heard or saw anything whilst living there. When I met with a letting agent to hand the keys back at the property, and for him to run through a final inspection, he asked if we had been happy there. I said something to the effect of yes, but we were only moving as the landlord had it up for sale. It became clear he was after some kind of ghost story as he explained that none of his colleagues liked going to any apartments in the building because when taking photos to market one of them, the red eye detector kept triggering on his phone when no one was in frame. The poor guy looked nervous as heck the whole time we were there. I photograph homes. The weirdest one was mostly very creepy and suspicious. I photographed a billionaire's compound where the guy had an absurd fascination with flesh. There were well over 50 heads mounted on walls from water buffalo to elephant. 5-10 large cats, stuffed. Chandeliers made from the feathers of rare birds. Stools made from elephant feet legs. They were hairy. Ugh. Paintings and abstract photos of oily skin. Veiny muscles of humans and animals etc etc. I looked for his kill room, but I never found it. In general I find billionaires don't behave like normal people, but this one was particularly weird. That there was a secret passageway and stairs between bedrooms on the second and third floors that no one now could find, but it was there. well hidden. My aunt is a realtor and was selling a house that a lady owned but was renting out to her college-age son and a few of his friends. When they went to do the first walkthrough so my aunt could take pictures and such, it was apparent the lady hadn't been in the house in ages. Every single room had a TV, a chair, a box of Kleenex, and a bottle of lotion. They were literally just jacking it with each other all over the house all the time. The lady was so embarrassed. Failed to sell a townhouse built in the 1800s last year. Two separate buyers said they could still feel the previous owners in the house and that's what put them off making an offer. Spooky as both sets of buyers used a specific phrase that they feel whatever is still a presence there. But seriously, I've been in 100 spooky houses with gruesome backstories and I've only got the serious creeps in 2 or 3 over my whole career. Not a realtor, but when the sold sign went up on our last house our neighbor came over and said, "Now you're moving out. Would you like to know about your house's history?" It turned out the previous owner was a rich dealer who allowed his customers to shoot up in the living room. Explains the brown arcs all over the walls when we stripped the wallpaper. He also used to pimp his wife out from an upstairs room, our then bedroom. Lovely. I've been doing this job for a while now. The thing that scares me most is how often I find the locks reversed on bedroom basement doors. There's lots of crappy parents out there. An old friend of mine bought a nice house in a quiet neighborhood. The place is beautiful and has a really nice deck out back with a hot tub. About 3 weeks after closing he was cleaning out some previously owner junk in one of the closets and found an old DVD. It was a Bridget the Midget porno with a hot tub scene on the cover. His hot tub. It was epic. Not a realtor, just a buyer, and not really disturbing, just moderately amusing. Just days after closing on my house, a friend of mine who was helping me move and told me he had been in my house many times. Turns out, his childhood babysitter had lived there. Then he tells me he wants to show me something in the backyard, and he leads me to a specific fence post on which he had drawn a dong as a kid. I do wonder if he had actually drawn it that day while I wasn't watching. In Seattle there was a house just up the block from my work. This was probably around 2007-08 or so. There was a zombie themed rave and said house became the after party. Most of the club kids knew each other and the ages ranged from like 16 to 21. Unfortunately they invited this loner dude who came over and started unloading a shotgun around 6:37 in the morning. Kids dressed like zombies were pouring out of the house, jumping over fences, into the street, into the backyard. Nobody knew who was actually wounded and who wasn't because everybody looked fricked up due to their costume. I think like 6-7 died. It was totally fricked and has always stuck with me. Probably because it was in my neighborhood in which I lived and worked. Eventually the house went up for sale and I always wondered how much the prospective buyers knew about what happened there. Houses in Seattle don't stay long on the market, so it had a lot of real estate agents and buyers coming and going. I also wondered if there was a little discount considering its history. Not a realtor, but I've been in the residential property management industry for 14 years and have managed leased thousands of apartments and single family houses. A historic building I used to lease apartments for was formerly an insane asylum and prior to that was a hospital. The building itself is on the National Historical Registry. Anyways, certain things are required for historical landmarks and restoration tax credits in this particular city, so in many of the apartments had to maintain certain features of the original design architecture, like some old tile was still on the walls and floors. The thing that creeped me out was the basement. Even after 50+ years, on most days you could catch a whiff of formaldehyde. Some days were more pungent and distinct than others. Of course, being the basement, it also had the addition of that musty basement smell. Since this was once a hospital, obviously it had a morgue. There are a handful of apartments in the basement and the original tile on the floor marked where the morgue actually started. In one of those apartments there is a bedroom with incredibly spacious walk-in closets. If you haven't already figured it out, these two massive closets are the old body lockers with the original latches on the walls next to the entrance to the closets. I still for the life of me cannot understand how anyone could live in that apartment, because I wouldn't even go into that apartment by myself. One of our sellers killed himself in their living room while we already had a buyer in place. Postponed the sale while the drywall was fixed. Didn't have to disclose. My uncle bought a caravan down the coast on a well-known beach. Just prior to selling it, police detectives turn up and turn the place upside down and inside out looking for some sort of information. It turns out the family of one of Australia's most notorious serial killers used to own the caravan many years ago. Not a realtor. Happened to some friends who bought a property, very old site, about 300 years old, which had been part of a convent. The living room of the nuns exactly. The aforementioned place had been refurbished as small apartments houses about 50 years ago. They went to live there and there was some maintenance given to certain places of the property, the common areas. There was a wall which was slightly wider than the others. They began to give maintenance to that wall, but the outer layer fell apart due to the rain and age. While trying to fix that, they found dozens of skeletons of babies. Very little babies and very old little skeletons. Well, authorities and historians came and went by, and they came to the conclusion that the nuns tossed their babies there right after giving birth to them. Lord knows if they were alive or dead by then. Not unheard of. Old religious orders were very strict about that, and there were even more gruesome policies regarding nuns' pregnancies. Not a realtor, but I have a friend who recently bought a house. She has lived in it for a year and went up in the attic for the first time to check on a leak. In the dark she could see some kind of painting hung up on the wall. She went to check it out and found a large commissioned painting of Jesus, giving the previous owner of the house a hand job. This is in a very Mormon area, a block away from a Mormon temple. Not necessarily disturbing, but kind of sad. We were selling a condo of a couple who were both 99 and married for like 80 years. Their condo was in original 1968 condition. Shag carpet, avocado green appliances, thick texture wallpaper. They were moving to be closer to their children and their already purchased gravestones. They knew death was coming and wanted to make it easier for their families. Pretty sweet. Anyways, they were very nice but ended up dying about a year later. The husband and wife died about 3 weeks apart. The house 2 doors down from ours was for sale in mid-July and the realtor was showing it to a prospective buyer when this happened. A couple of kids set off leftover fireworks at the bottom of the slope past the development. This being California in summer, the entire hillside of dried grasses caught fire immediately. Now you don't see much of these anymore because the construction material got outlawed, but cedar shake roofs were fashionable for a while. Our development got grandfathered in. So everyone on the last street in the block grabbed a garden hose, collectively put out the fire, and hosed down the rooftops. Except for the realtor, who turned around garden hose in hand to see the roof already on fire of the house he was showing. It was too high and too far along to put out with garden hoses, so by the time the fire truck arrived the entire second floor was a loss. A local contractor got a lot of business in the months that followed, replacing our neighborhood's cedar roofs. Well, not me, but a house that my parents own. My father was speaking with the previous owner about anything he needs to know about the house. The previous owner starts mentioning that a man who lived in the house as a tenant was brutally shot and only made it to the backyard before he had died from loss of blood. This house is located in a very bad area of our city, so shootings are not at all uncommon. Fast forward a few years and we find out that one of the people living in our house was selling drugs. The drug dealer is eventually arrested in that house, leaving his wife, mother-in-law, and daughter in the house. Few years more and we needed to kick out our tenants because they hadn't paid rent for months. A few nights after my parents went to go tell the tenants to leave or else they were gonna get kicked out, the house burst into flames. A very large portion of the house was in ruins. All the kitchen, one of the rooms, and most of the living room burned to a crisp. Luckily the insurance covered the damage. Thankfully the house has been sold. Last thing that I heard about it is our now ex-tenant, a new one, was not paying rent and got into a very nasty fist fight with the people in the neighborhood. He got into the house completely covered in blood and bruises. They had to call the ambulance to save the guy too. A small word of advice, people. If you are going to buy a house, always take location into account. Sometimes buying a house in a dangerous neighborhood for a cheaper price can prove to be a big mistake. I've been witness to a few and heard of some others. The first one involves a couple who bought a house in the 1980s. They called me a couple years ago wanting to sell. As we're talking, the wife starts telling me about her difficult pregnancies and how she'd been pregnant many times but lost them all. I feel bad for her, but I'm wondering what this has to do with anything. The husband pipes up and says, After the last one, I didn't know what to do. I came home and the first thing I thought to do was remodel the kitchen. I had to break something. He goes on about his impromptu kitchen demolition. Dishes still in the cabinets and everything. The guy was devastated that they'd lost another baby. Anyway, he says he's ripping out a corner and he always knew there was a dead pocket there because the span was like 3 feet, but the closet behind it was only 2 feet deep. He rips out a drywall and finds a ball of cloth. As he pulls back the layers, he realizes it's the skeleton of a baby. It was wrapped up with a teddy bear. He called the police and said they never got any follow-up on it. The next was from another realtor I knew. They get to a closing and the seller is late. An hour goes by and he's still a no-show. The agent is calling and getting no answer. She knew the seller's nephew who let her in once or something, so she calls him. He drives over to check on his uncle. He opens the door and there's the uncle, dead on the floor. He's wearing his coat and has one shoe on. He died putting his shoes on so he could go to the closing. And yes, the buyers still bought the house, but it took a few extra weeks to close. Another one from my own experience was a house I was asked to sell. It was a fixer-upper, but it was on a nice plot of land. The sellers had some weird relationship going on. She was in her 20s and he was in his 50s. They were married, but she called him daddy and she dressed like a mess. They were not well off by any means, so it's not like she was with him for the money. Anyway, I decided to Google their names to see what came up. They'd been busted for running a puppy mill in the garage and all the dogs were discovered frozen solid in the dead of winter and severely malnourished. After that, I just ignored them. I couldn't even talk to them to tell them I wasn't going to list their house. I'm not a realtor, but suppose the story's relevant. My extended family used to live in a really old house located just north of London. Previously it used to be Queen Victoria's stop when she was traveling in the area. I am told my uncle, mum's sister's husband, when younger never believed in ghosts or spirits and would be the first one to call it a load of rubbish. He was sleeping one night and was awoken by a man staring at him at the end of his bed, dressed in an old army uniform. My uncle froze for a few seconds, panicked and flicked the bedside lamp on, and then the man vanished. He refused to sleep in that room from that night onwards. We later found out that the man was a previous owner who had returned from war to find his wife having an affair. He was so furious that his wife reported to have told her he would do the worst thing possible to get back at her. He took his twin sons, toddlers at the time, went to the back of the garden where there was a forest and shot them both dead before killing himself. The funny thing is that since my family bought the property, my uncle had twin sons, my mum had twin sons, and my uncle's brother, who is also a part owner of the property, had twin sons. The weirder part is that my brothers and my uncle and his kids were playing near the forest when they were in their early teens and kept on saying they heard boys laughing but couldn't see anybody there, not knowing the house's history. You have been visited by the Holy Doggo. Like this video and subscribe for a good luck. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day, you magnificent people.